Welcome, everyone. My name is So-Young Lee, and I'm the Landon and Lavinia Clay Chief Curator here at the Harvard Art Museums, and I will be serving as the moderator for our Q&A session later on. Before we begin today's program, the Harvard Art Museums acknowledges that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and we strive to honor this relationship. Thank you for joining us for our first Art Talk Live of the new year. This ongoing series offers an up-close look at works from our collection with the staff of the Harvard Art Museums. And though the museums remain closed for now, you can join us on Zoom every other week for these short interactive talks that investigate artists' materials and techniques, reveal our latest discoveries, and explore big ideas using the collections of the Harvard Art Museums. So before we begin, just a few points of logistics. We are using the webinar format in Zoom, so we invite you to submit brief questions via the Q&A box, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen. The presentation will last approximately 15 minutes, and we'll devote the last 10 to 15 minutes to questions. So please feel free to submit or type in your questions in the Q&A box throughout the presentation, though we will hold them till the end of the presentation itself. And we'll do our best to get to as many of the questions as possible and try to conclude the talk just around 2:30. And now I am very pleased to introduce our speaker today. Joanna Seidenstein is the Stanley H. Durwood Foundation Curatorial Fellow in the Division of European and American Art at the Harvard Art Museums, and a specialist of 17th century Dutch art. And at the museums, Joanna carries out important research on our Dutch art collections and is currently preparing an upcoming exhibition on the drawn landscape in Dutch art. Today, Joanna will focus our attention on an unusual and moving depiction of a Roma woman and child by Dutch artist Jacques de Gheyn, exploring this drawing in relation to broader visual and literary traditions and to the realities of the lives of the Roma people in 17th century Netherlands. So with that, I will turn things over to Joanna.
Thank you so much, So-Young. And thanks to all of you for being here today after an especially eventful and difficult day in the US and after a difficult year that has laid bare such divisions within the country. This talk will, to an extent, address themes of division and misperception with an eye toward a more hopeful future for all. And I am very excited to share with you today some research on and around what is really my favorite drawing anywhere, a work that I've been excited to explore since before my arrival at Harvard. It's a work that has been an important presence here for many years, but as of just last month, it has officially become part of the museum's collection as one of many gifts to the institution from the renowned collector George Abrams. This drawing was made by the late 16th, early 17th century artist Jacques de Gheyn II. The son of a painter, de Gheyn was born in Antwerp in the southern Netherlands, and in 1580 immigrated with his parents to Utrecht in the northern Netherlands, the region that would soon become the autonomous Dutch Republic. After training in Haarlem with the celebrated printmaker Hendrik Goltzius, de Gheyn moved around to various Dutch cities, and it was probably in the university city of Leiden that he made this work, a small figure study. Just over 6 inches in height, it's a drawing you could hold in the palm of your hand. And looking closely, almost as if we're looking at the work in person with a magnifying glass, we can see the dazzling penwork with which de Gheyn renders these figures, from the twisting, zigzagging lines that describe the folds of the drapery and convey the weight of that cascading cloth, to the curving, swelling pen strokes that suggest the volumes of the woman's crouching body, and the rapid looping curls that form the shadows of the child's walking stick and leg. De Gheyn's technique lends a kind of swirling energy to what is otherwise a very still, quiet image. The poses are static, the expressions subtle, not exaggerated. It's a depiction of a most natural interaction between a woman and a child, one bespeaking familial, presumably maternal, love. Based on the woman's headdress and cloak and the child's walking stick, these figures can be identified as Roma, a transnational people of diverse cultural practices, religions, and professions who live in many places around the world, but predominantly in Europe. Long known in the English language as gypsies, a term now widely considered to be derogatory, Roma have suffered persistent discrimination for hundreds of years, and at times outright persecution and enslavement. And the ongoing marginalization and even demonization they have faced has been expressed through language. And so I, a non-Roma, want to say a word about my choice of terminology. Although some members of this diverse population do embrace the term gypsy, while yet others use terms that refer to more specific groups like Sinti and Romani, studies suggest that most prefer the term Roma as a personal identifier and as a term to denote their collective political identity. In the Romani language, the word Roma, plural for Rome, R-O-M, means men, but has come to refer to both the male and female members of these communities. And the term Romani is actually the adjectival form, though in English language writing, Roma is often used as both noun and adjective. So in the hope of using language that is respectful and inclusive, these are the terms I will be using today. Now, it is generally understood that the Roma trace their ancestry to the northern Indian subcontinent, though it is believed that the people who would become the Roma left that region more than 1,500 years ago. And it is well documented that Roma have been in Europe for at least 700 years. In spite of that fact, to this day, the Roma are often seen as foreign, as persistent outsiders, continually itinerant, and sometimes even criminal. These stereotypes are reflected in and perpetuated by the visual tradition, which has been dominated by non-Roma artists. And I need to acknowledge that this talk does center a work, albeit an unusual one, by a non-Roma artist. But I hope that discussing this drawing and its complex relationship to the visual tradition can illuminate the ways in which art can construct and affirm racial and social hierarchies, but also challenge them. And more specifically, we can look at this drawing as an entryway to understanding the experiences of actual Roma communities, past and present. So I actually want to take a moment to foreground the work of some contemporary Roma artists, which, as you can imagine, spans every considerable subject, theme, medium, and style. But given that the representation of Roma people and history has been so dominated by non-Roma makers, these are indeed subjects of great importance to many Roma artists working today. And here I show an example in Harvard's collection of a work by the artist Alfred Ulrich, who over the past couple of decades has combined his art making with activism, as in this performance piece of 2000, when he threw pearls from his sister's necklace on the ground at the site of the former Czech-run concentration camp in Lety. Hundreds of thousands of Roma were murdered in Europe during the Holocaust. Ulrich's performance piece critiqued this particular site where members of Ulrich's own family were killed for its partial erasure of this history through the camp's repurposing as an active pig farm. More recently, the Roma artist Małgorzata Mirga-Tas created a memorial to the Roma executed in Borszezin, Poland in 1942. In 2016, the memorial was brutally vandalized, so the artist rebuilt it with new materials and made wax molds of the damaged pieces, which she then transformed into new installations that comment on both the 20th and 21st century violence. The same artist also produces more positive imagery of Roma, including her own family members living their daily lives. These beautiful works are based on observation, on the lived experiences of real people. And in this way, and in the artist's choice of imagery, they directly challenge the stereotypes found in the Western art canon and in the media and popular culture today. Interestingly and alarmingly, these stereotypes are not always recognized as such, almost as if representations of Roma are often seen as pictorial types, divorced from any real individuals or real history. And so I want to recognize explicitly that some of the works I will show today are informed by, if not expressive of, racism in their othering or outright derogatory treatment of Roma. Indeed, Roma have been portrayed in numerous works of art, literature, music, ballet, and theater, probably most famously the opera Carmen, based on a mid-19th century novella and first staged in 1875. The title character, a Roma woman, is a seductress who associates with smugglers, and a headstrong, free-spirited femme fatale, unwilling to settle and conform. And then there is Esmeralda from Victor Hugo's famous 1831 novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, a beautiful enchantress, but also kind and generous. And, spoiler alert, it turns out not Roma, but the daughter of a nobleman and poor Frenchwoman who had been kidnapped as a baby. This plot twist comes right out of a 17th century Spanish text, La Gitanilla, or The Little Gypsy Girl by Cervantes. This highly influential novel is the story of a nobleman who falls in love with a Roma girl, Preciosa, only to learn in the end that she is in fact noble birth as well, also kidnapped as a baby. This text and its many translations and theatrical adaptations, including 2 written for the Amsterdam stage in the 1640s, sparked many paintings depicting the story. And examples like this Dutch painting, Difference, between Preciosa and her adoptive Roma mother, and between the nobleman and his presumably enslaved Black servant, are emphatically enunciated. But we can trace the broader visual tradition to long before the 17th century. To my knowledge, these are the earliest known representations of Roma in European art. You can see what all 3 share are the head coverings and the women holding small children. The representation of Roma women in particular was further codified in the 16th century in costume books, with cloak, headdress, and child becoming consistent identifying attributes. We also see in the 16th century the first overt depictions of Roma fortune tellers. Documents from the period do indicate that some Roma did seek to make their livings through palmistry and chiromancy, but this quickly came to dominate non-Roma perceptions, and to some extent still does today. Here in the central panel of Bosch's Haywain triptych, amidst the array of foreground figures representing folly, we see, magnified in the detail at right, a noblewoman having her palm read by a Roma woman carrying a baby, while a small child seems to tug at the patron's dress. It's not entirely clear what this child is doing, but in this tapestry from the same period, a Roma woman quite clearly picks the pocket of a man having his palm read by another. And this motif becomes very popular in the early 17th century. We see it here in the foreground of this landscape painting by Paul Brill, a Flemish artist active in Rome, now showing a small child doing the pickpocketing. It is also the central subject of many works by followers of Caravaggio. Notably, several of these, like the work by Vouet at left, include a figure who makes eye contact with the viewer, an established pictorial device for signaling irony or humor. More unusually, the work at right includes a figure who points to his own eye, as if to say to his companion, "Open your eyes to what is happening," or perhaps, "Don't let your eyes be seduced by the beautiful young woman who enchants you while your money is stolen." De Gheyn's drawing, made just a handful of years before those last examples, seems emphatically to resist the iconography of the thieving fortune teller. The woman depicted here holds the child's hand, palm down, specifically not telling his fortune, and neither is engaged in any thievery. Nor is the child just an identifying attribute. This little boy or girl does, however, like the figure in the Vouet painting, look directly at us, the eyes drawn so emphatically, such that some scholars have raised the question of whether or not he or she is blind. Importantly, this is not a finished work, although it may have ended up in the hands of a drawings collector as early as the 17th century. It was not initially made for an audience. Rather, it served de Gheyn in his studio, along with 3 other figure studies featuring Roma. These 2 works depicting Roma women with children, about the same size as the Abrams drawing, and this slightly larger sheet with studies of a woman and a young man. All of these drawings are executed in the same technique on the same type of coarse, fibrous paper, and it's very likely that de Gheyn made them at the same moment. These works have the appearance of drawings made, at least in part, from life, from direct observation. And because of documents that record various restrictions placed on the Roma by the Dutch Reformed Church and provincial governments of the period, we know that there were many Roma living in the northern Netherlands. And so these drawings may well represent actual Roma individuals that de Gheyn encountered and even possibly hired to pose for him. Of course, it is not clear where in these drawings observation might give way to imagination, reality to fiction. And of course, de Gheyn would have seen and perceived the Roma through the lens of the existing visual tradition. But these drawings nevertheless stand as very rare surviving examples of studies, of working as opposed to finished drawings depicting Roma. Their very function as figure studies points to a desire on de Gheyn's part to see and record for himself details of costume, physiognomy, even relationships, rather than to rely solely on previous depictions. And so this tender moment between a woman and child that may invoke but does not follow established iconography offers a sliver of a view of the Roma in 17th century Netherlands. Not just figure types, not stereotypes, but real people living real lives. That said, these drawings would serve de Gheyn as motifs for a finished work, a print that does contain stereotypes. We see here both de Gheyn's drawing for the print at left and at right the engraving made after it, printed in reverse and accompanied by Latin verses that speak primarily to the gullibility of the woman having her palm read, alluding to her love sickness and desire to pay only for the fortune she wants to hear. But you'll notice beyond the central protagonists, at the far edge of both drawing and print, a secondary figure group that very closely resembles figures from de Gheyn's studies, the boy from the Chicago sheet and the woman from the Abrams sheet. The latter is not exact, and at right, the woman holds an infant in her arms. You can see the top of its head peeking out. But these figures have very similar profiles, facial features, and expressions, smiling gently at their children, who in turn look out at us. The Abrams drawing this seems to serve as a model, not just for the female figure in the print, but also for the entire interaction depicted there, a moment of familial intimacy and maternal love, one that is quite literally marginalized in the print and transformed by context of the rest of the scene. That outward gaze now seeming to signal irony and fun-making. And because the print was the thing that circulated, it would become part of the long tradition of othering imagery of the Roma, probably directly informing works by Hendrik Averkamp featuring wealthy women and Roma fortune teller, sometimes with a bystander making eye contact with the viewer. And even these later paintings, the one at right bringing back the trope of the thieving fortune teller, now with a woman with a distinct resemblance to the mother in de Gheyn's print and drawing, doing the pickpocketing and looking at the viewer. So with these works, we have a vivid demonstration of the kind of transformation that often happens between study, preparatory drawing, and finished work made for the market, and of the proliferation of one kind of imagery and not another. But what is relegated to the margins of the print and to the memory of the lucky few who got to see the drawing before George Abrams acquired it in the 1980s and made it available for study and exhibition, a natural, loving moment between ostensibly real feeling people, does take center stage here, a reminder of the humanity of all people and of the universal experience of love. A warm thank you to my colleagues, and again to all of you for being here today. And if you're interested in learning more about Roma art and culture, here are 3 sites that I have found to be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Sorry, I had disappeared from the camera for a second there. That was a truly fascinating and incredibly engaging presentation, and also love the fact that you were able to share with us your insights on a work that has been so close to your heart for such a long time, even before you embarked on your professional career. So that was wonderful. We have a number of questions. So with that, maybe I'll start with Larry's question, which is prefaced with a bit of a statement about how Roma appear with turbans in Netherlandish art, as you've shown. Is the artist, is De Gheyn distancing himself with social superiority from the figures, as in his images of witches, or not? And how would you compare this intimate drawing, the one with the mother and the child, or the woman and child, to his rather finished works about spell wielding witches?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Indeed, Jacques de Gheyn's many depictions of witches are so relevant to the material, and the overlap between them and the depictions of Roma are, apparent. I think that at the same time, De Gheyn was working within the kind of intellectual circle that, on one hand, included people studying the Roma, studying their cultural practices, their language, and understanding them as real people, and very interested, genuinely interested in the practice of fortune telling, which of course has a much broader history of divination, that is also kind of lofty one that you find in Greco-Roman antiquity, and also understanding witchcraft to be completely made up and imagined. And there's a book you may know by Claudia Swan on this topic, really fascinating, that talks about these very influential publications on witchcraft from the period, that make very clear that this is a culture that understood that people who made allegations of witchcraft or themselves claimed to have supernatural powers were really were false, that they were perhaps suffering from mental illness, so they didn't use that language to explain it. And so there, for contemporary audiences, for the kind of people who I think would have been buying De Gheyn's prints, I think there would have been a real distinction at the same time. But indeed, the question of fortune telling and do you believe it or do you not, and that tension between, that we maybe experience even today, where we might be sure that, of course, it can't be real, and yet we might want to believe in it a little bit, was there too. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you, Joanna. So you began your presentation with a little bit of background on the Roma, and there's a question about whether have there been DNA studies establishing the Indian origin of Roma?
Yes, that belief is based on genetic evidence and also linguistic evidence, the relationship to the Romani language, to languages spoken in northern India, and there are many studies on the subject.
Thank you, Joanna. So of the 2 figures in the drawing that you focused on or started with, the child, I found very intriguing, and there are a couple of questions about the child. One being the stick, right? The stick of the child, does it confirm the blind child hypothesis, or can you say a little bit more about the child and sort of sight and of the condition, and any other representations of blind children or people?
Absolutely, yes. So it's a great question, and one I'm still kind of pondering, to be honest. But I indeed, the walking stick is something one sees in representations of blind figures in the early modern period, often with the other arm kind of reaching outward. But it is also extremely common in depictions of travelers or people believed to be travelers, and you see it in other depictions of Roma. And so I think it'd be difficult to say that that really weighs in one direction or the other. The eyes, de Gheyn did in other drawings, kind of emphasize the eyes with these kind of additional contours. And so it may just have been his way of drawing the eyes, of really emphasizing that this figure's looking outward. If he's thinking through already, maybe has his print in mind, or either way, just really kind of for himself, kind of working out like, what do I want this figure, to do for me? And, but I think it is possible that it was meant to suggest that this child was not sighted. And it's an interesting one to me because of the idea of fortune telling being about seeing the future. And there's a one I think probably many ancient figure, Tiresias, who's a blind seer, and so there's this long-standing association between physical blindness and inner sight and vision. And so I do wonder if that is actually at the heart of that drawing, but I'm not sure.
Actually, Joanna, could we return to the drawing again, and perhaps people could look even more closely at, now that you've described it a little bit more as well. Yeah, the eyes are quite striking. It does turn your focus onto the child's eyes. Another question about the child figure. Can we say something about the gender? There was one question actually asked, is the child's breast uncovered? And does that suggest something?
Yeah, this is something I was talking with a colleague about. And again, it's a question I have been thinking about as well. We tend to assume that these child figures are boys. And the hat does look a little bit less like the hat of Roma, female Roma figures, and a little more just like a cap that a young man might wear. And then there are, among the other works I showed, the Roma children do seem to be boys. They do seem to be male, although perhaps that's not entirely certain either. But I do think it's interesting that he's wearing this cloak that's open and revealing his I'm saying he, because I'm used to using that pronoun, but he or she has this exposed chest, because the cloak is very much like what Roma women wear, and there are many depictions of Roma women with bare breasts, sometimes nursing or in a more sexualized context. And so if this is actually a girl, a Roma, a woman to be, that is very interesting to me, and it kind of fits with the broader visual representation of women and girls, where the girl is maybe playing with a doll and kind of acting out the kind of maternal role they'll eventually fulfill. And perhaps that is going on here too, or one of multiple thoughts de Gheyn is working through as he's making these drawings, and for himself, and maybe in a more open-ended, open-minded way.
Thank you, Joanna. I think we might have time for one final question. There's an interesting question about, is there a connection between the Black Virgin Marys in some southern French churches and the Roma?
Well, this is a very interesting question. I don't know if I can speak with much expertise on those particular works, but I can show somewhere in my bonus images here. Sorry, there are a lot of them. A work like this.
Joanna was prepared.
This is one of many works that is sometimes even referred to as Roma Madonna, Madonna. But I believe, my understanding and that of other scholars who've worked on this, including Victor Soichida, that this is, an artist looking at the Roma and understanding what they were wearing in the 17th century as being the same as what they always had worn, and thought, antiquity onward. And there was also a misconception, still prevalent probably in the 17th century, that the Roma had come from Egypt. And that's actually, the term gypsy derives from this misconception. And so for works depicting biblical scenes that even take place in or around the region of Egypt, I think it made sense to artists to use that costume. And so I don't believe, in this case anyway, that the figure of the Virgin is meant to read as Roma, but that it's an artist, thinking about the Roma as a kind of, as if that's like an authentic costume. But then the fact that you have these depictions of contemporary Roma with their children, and then the Holy Family looking so very similar, is fascinating, and something that viewers must have taken note of and been thinking about. In terms of the representations of the Virgin as a Black woman with dark skin, I believe that comes from the same kind of desire to present a more authentic depiction of the Holy Family. It may indeed relate to the Roma, but I can't say. I don't know myself, but it's a very interesting question.
Thank you, Joanna. You have many accolades in the Q&A box on the wonderful presentation you gave and how much people have been able to learn from this. So thank you again to our presenter, Joanna. And thank you all for joining us today. After you leave the session, you will receive a link to a short online survey, which I hope you'll take a moment to complete. We are very grateful for the feedback that you provide. And unfortunately, we have recently had to cancel our next talk, or the talk that had been scheduled for January 14th. But I'd like to warmly invite everyone to join for the next talk, the following talk, Art Talk Live, Setting the Fans Afloat, on Thursday, January 21st at 2 p.m. And in this talk, exhibition designer Ellie Glynn and production specialist Sean Lunsford will explain the creative process behind a display of framed fans by the artist Suzuki Kiitsu, featured in our special exhibition, Painting Edo, Japanese Art from the Feinberg Collection. And you can find the link to register and information about other upcoming programs on our online calendar. And with that, I thank Joanna again for her fantastic presentation, and I thank our audiences for taking time your afternoon to join us. Thank you.